My best friend's sister ruined my life by lying about being pregnant, but I found out about who has behind it. All right, buckle up. My life went from smooth sailing to a full on train wreck in what felt like seconds. All thanks to my best friend's sister, Jenny. If someone told me a year ago that she'd be the one to flip my world upside down, I'd have laughed. But here we are. It started with a phone call. Jenny and I had known each other forever. She was Dave's little sister, always in the background, never someone I had much interaction with. So when she called, I figured it was about something trivial. Maybe she needed advice or help with something mundane. But no, Jenny didn't waste time. She dropped a bombshell right away, saying she was pregnant and claiming the baby was mine. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke. There was no way that was possible. I'd never been involved with her in any way, not even a hug or anything close to it. But she was insistent, her tone unwavering, accusing me of abandoning her and the baby before it even arrived. I was stunned. My mind raced through every interaction we'd ever had, trying to make sense of this impossible accusation. There was nothing. It didn't add up. But she wasn't backing down. And when I suggested a paternity test, she flat out refused, saying she didn't need to prove anything. At first, I thought the situation would blow over. How could anyone believe something so absurd? But I underestimated how quickly rumors can spread. It didn't take long for my parents to hear about it, and when they did, the fallout was brutal. My mom was heartbroken, saying she couldn't believe I'd be so reckless. My dad was furious, calling me irresponsible and demanding I man up. No matter how much I denied it, their disappointment was written all over their faces. Every family dinner turned into a barrage of guilt and judgment. They weren't listening to me, only to the rumors. Even my friends started to question me. People I'd known for years would pull me aside and ask if I was absolutely sure it wasn't true. Their doubt cut deeper than I expected. It was like my entire support system was crumbling, and I couldn't stop it. The only one who seemed to believe me was Dave. He told me to let it go, that Jenny was fragile and had been through a lot. He kept saying it was best not to push her or stir things up. But how could I just sit back and let her ruin my reputation with a lie? I thought things couldn't get worse, but I was wrong. This was just the beginning. Once the rumors spread, my life started unraveling faster than I could handle. What began as Jenny's baseless claim turned into a full-blown family and social disaster. My parents made it their mission to remind me at every opportunity how disappointed they were. Dinners became unbearable. My mom would look at me like I'd committed some heinous crime, shaking her head in quiet disapproval. My dad, on the other hand, was loud and clear. He'd rant about how he thought he'd raised me better and how I needed to own up to my responsibilities. I couldn't escape it. At work, my co-workers started giving me looks. A couple of them even cracked jokes about me joining the dad club. Friends who I thought would have my back started acting weird, too. Some outright asked if I was hiding something, while others just distanced themselves. The worst part was that Jenny wasn't even helping herself. She played the victim perfectly, painting a picture of a scared, abandoned mother-to-be. She told anyone who would listen that I was trying to deny my child, making me sound like the villain. And then, my parents took it up a notch. One evening, my dad sat me down. Well, more like cornered me, and laid it all out. If I didn't step up, he said, I could forget about being part of the family. They wouldn't support a deadbeat, even if that deadbeat was their own son. That's when I hit my breaking point. I wasn't just dealing with rumors anymore. This was a full-on smear campaign, and no one wanted to hear my side of the story. It didn't matter how many times I said, "It's not true," or begged for someone to listen. The damage was done. I realized I couldn't rely on anyone, not even Dave. He still believed me, or at least that's what he said, but he kept asking me to let it go. Jenny's fragile, he'd repeat like a mantra. Pushing her will only make things worse. Worse for who? It was already a nightmare for me. My parents' ultimatum hit hard. I couldn't believe they'd cut me off over something so ridiculous. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't just cave in. I wasn't going to take responsibility for a child that wasn't mine. I spent nights tossing and turning, wondering how my life had spiraled out of control so fast. I started questioning everything: my relationships, my choices, even my self-worth. But one thing was clear: I couldn't let Jenny get away with this. That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. If Jenny wouldn't take a paternity test voluntarily, I'd have to force her legally. It was a gamble. But at that point, I had nothing left to lose. What I didn't know was how much worse things would get before they got better. With my parents cutting me off emotionally and threatening to do it financially, I realized there was no one left to defend me but myself. I wasn't going to let Jenny's lie define me. If she wanted to play games, fine. But I was bringing receipts. The first step was figuring out how to force a paternity test. I reached out to a lawyer, explaining the whole twisted mess. I half expected them to look at me like I was crazy, but instead, they nodded like they'd seen it all before. Apparently, cases like this weren't unheard of. Filing for a legal paternity test wasn't as simple as I'd hoped, though. Jenny wasn't making it easy. She dodged every attempt to serve her the paperwork, forcing me to hire a process server. Meanwhile, she doubled down on her story, telling mutual acquaintances that I was trying to bully her. The pressure from my parents didn't let up either. My mom called me one night, crying again. She begged me to stop dragging Jenny through the mud. "She's carrying your child," she said. "Why can't you just be a man about this?" That call ended with me yelling, "It's not my kid," and hanging up. I hated every second of it. The doubt, the isolation, the constant barrage of accusations. It all weighed on me. My lawyer reassured me, saying the truth would come out eventually. But how long could I hold on when the whole world seemed to be against me? Finally, after weeks of back and forth, Jenny was served the papers. I'll never forget the text she sent me that day. "You're disgusting. You're going to regret this." In the meantime, I started gathering evidence of my own. I went through my phone records, scoured old messages, and even had to relive every interaction I'd ever had with Jenny. I knew there was no way I was the father, but I needed to be ready for whatever curveball she might throw. Then came the court hearing. It wasn't a long session, but it was brutal. Jenny showed up with a sad, tired expression, clutching her stomach for effect. Her lawyer painted me as a callous, unfeeling jerk, trying to get out of my responsibilities. I stayed quiet, letting my lawyer do the talking. When the judge ordered the paternity test, I felt like I could finally breathe. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a step in the right direction. The wait for the results was agonizing. Every day felt like a year, and I kept imagining worst-case scenarios. What if the results got tampered with? What if Jenny somehow convinced the court to dismiss them? I didn't trust her for a second, but when the results finally came back, everything changed. The day the paternity test results came back felt like a breaking point. I had spent weeks with a knot in my stomach, imagining every possible outcome. Even though I knew there was no way I was the father, the constant doubt and accusations had burrowed into my brain. The envelope arrived in the mail, thick and foreboding. I stared at it for what felt like hours before finally ripping it open. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely unfold the paper. My eyes scanned the page, skipping past all the medical jargon until I landed on the one line that mattered: 0% probability of paternity. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by a wave of anger. This nightmare, all the sleepless nights, the family fallout, the constant judgment had been for nothing. Jenny's lie had turned my life upside down, and now I had the proof I'd been waiting for. The first thing I did was call my parents. My dad picked up, and before he could say anything, I told him straight. I got the test results. I'm not the father. There was a long pause, and then he said, Are you sure? Are you sure? As if I'd been faking it this whole time. My mom got on the line, sobbing, and said something about how mistakes happen and how maybe the test wasn't accurate. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Even with cold, hard evidence, they still doubted me. Mom, Dad, I said, my voice shaking with frustration. It's over. I have the results. I'm done being your punching bag. Then I hung up. Part of me hoped they'd apologize, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. They'd invested so much into believing Jenny's story that admitting they were wrong might have been too much for them to handle. But the fallout didn't stop there. I sent a screenshot of the results to Dave. He responded almost immediately, saying he was glad it was resolved and hoped we could all move on. Move on? I wanted to scream. How could he act like this was just a minor inconvenience? As for Jenny, she stayed silent. No texts, no calls, nothing. It felt like the calm before a storm, and I wasn't wrong. A week later, she showed up at my door, tears streaming down her face, clutching an envelope. She handed it to me without a word and walked away. Confused, I opened it right there, my stomach churning. What I found inside shattered what little was left of my faith in the people I thought I knew. At first, I thought it might be an apology, but as I read, my confusion turned into pure disbelief. The letter admitted that she had lied about the baby being mine. But that wasn't the real bombshell. Jenny claimed someone had paid her to pin the pregnancy on me. My heart started racing as I read the next part. The person behind the lie was none other than Dave, my best friend. The letter was clear. Dave had been the one to convince her to do it. According to Jenny, he had fed her lines, coached her on what to say, and even offered her money to keep up the charade. At first, she thought she could go through with it, but when the paternity test came back, she realized it was over and couldn't keep lying. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Dave? My best friend? The guy who'd been in my corner since middle school? The one person who had claimed to believe me throughout this entire nightmare? My mind flashed back to every moment he'd told me to let it go, every time he'd said Jenny was fragile, and I should tread carefully. Now it all made sense. He wasn't trying to protect Jenny. He was trying to protect himself. I dropped the letter and sat down, my head spinning. Why would Dave do this? What was his motive? As much as I didn't want to believe it, the pieces started falling into place. Dave had always seemed a little bitter about certain things. My job, my relationships, even the way his parents got along better with me than with him. But I never thought he'd go this far. It was like a switch flipped in my brain. The betrayal burned hotter than any of the accusations from my family or Jenny. This was Dave, the guy who was supposed to have my back. I needed answers. I grabbed my phone and called him. He picked up on the second ring, his usual cheery tone greeting me. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then, I simply asked, "Why?" Dave's silence told me everything. After a long pause, he sighed and said, "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," I shot back, my voice shaking with anger. What he said next was something I'll never forget. "You had everything, man. The job, the friends, even my parents liked you more than me. I just wanted to level the playing field." Level the playing field? By destroying my life? I couldn't even respond. I just hung up and sat there, staring at the wall. My world had already been shaken by Jenny's lie. But this was a betrayal on a whole new level. I wasn't sure what to do next, but one thing was certain. I was done with Dave, Jenny, and anyone else who had turned their back on me. After Dave's shocking confession, I sat in silence, letting his words echo in my head. You had everything. I just wanted to level the playing field. The sheer audacity of it was mind-numbing. This wasn't just some petty jealousy. This was someone I'd trusted, someone I'd considered family. deliberately tearing my life apart. For hours, I replayed every interaction with him over the years. All the little moments I'd brushed off suddenly felt loaded. The offhand remarks about my job, the way he'd act cold whenever his parents praised me, the times he'd suggest I was lucky in ways he never was. It was like seeing our entire friendship through a cracked lens. But the more I thought about it, the clearer one thing became. I couldn't keep these people in my life. Dave and Jenny had caused irreparable damage, and my parents had chosen to believe their lies without hesitation. Holding on to any of them would only keep reopening the wounds. I started by blocking Dave's number. I wanted to confront him again, to tell him exactly how much he'd hurt me. But what was the point? He didn't care. His apology, if you could call it that, wasn't about fixing things. It was just his way of justifying his betrayal. Next, I texted my parents. I didn't want another emotional phone call filled with excuses and guilt trips, so I kept it short. The paternity test proves I'm not the father. Jenny admitted she lied, and Dave was behind it. You believe them over me. I can't forgive that. I need space. Don't contact me. Hitting send was harder than I expected. They were still my parents, after all. But the way they'd treated me over the past months had shattered any trust I had in them. If they could turn on me so quickly, what did that say about our relationship? As for Jenny, I didn't bother responding to her letter. She'd already done enough damage, and frankly, I didn't care about her reasons anymore. Whether she was manipulated by Dave or acted out of desperation didn't matter. She'd still chosen to lie. Cutting them all out wasn't easy. My phone was flooded with calls and texts in the days that followed. My mom sent long messages begging me to talk to her, saying they didn't know what to believe and thought they were doing the right thing. My dad kept it brief, saying I was overreacting and that family sticks together, even when we make mistakes. Mistakes? This wasn't a mistake. This was months of deliberate betrayal, judgment, and cruelty. Dave even tried reaching out through mutual friends. One texted me, saying Dave wanted to explain his side of the story. I told them I wasn't interested and that if they wanted to stay in my life, they'd drop it. Thankfully, most of my friends sided with me once they heard the full story. For the first time in months, I felt a small sense of control. I had spent so much time defending myself, trying to make people believe me, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand my ground. Cutting them off wasn't just about getting rid of the toxicity. It was about reclaiming my life. But as I started rebuilding, the scars from their betrayal lingered. How do you move forward when the people you trusted most are the ones who hurt you the worst? After cutting ties with Dave, Jenny, and my parents, I was left with the silence. At first, it felt like relief. A weight lifted off my chest. But as the days turned into weeks, that silence grew heavy. My phone stopped buzzing with calls and texts. My weekends were emptier without family obligations, and the reality of starting over hit me hard. I realized how much I'd built my life around people who didn't deserve my trust. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about figuring out how to move forward when the foundation I thought I had was gone. The first step was focusing on the friends who had stuck by me. Not everyone had believed Jenny's lie, and those who did were quick to apologize when the truth came out. One of my closest friends, Chris, had been quietly supporting me the whole time, even when others doubted me. He reminded me that I wasn't alone, even if it felt that way. One night, over a few beers at Chris's place, I finally opened up about everything. I told him about the test, the confession, and how my parents had turned their backs on me. Chris listened without judgment, and when I was done, he just said, "Man, you're stronger than you think. You're not the one who messed up. They are." Those words stuck with me. I threw myself into work, picking up extra projects and taking on new challenges. It was a distraction at first, but eventually it became a source of pride. I realized that while my family had been busy tearing me down, I'd built something they couldn't touch, a career I loved, and a reputation that was mine alone. But rebuilding trust in others, that was harder. I started questioning everyone's motives, wondering if they were being honest or hiding something. Even simple interactions felt loaded. A coworker asking about my weekend made me wonder if they'd heard about the drama. Therapy became a lifeline. I'd never been the type to talk to a stranger about my problems, but my therapist helped me see things more clearly. She reminded me that the betrayal said more about them than it did about me. It wasn't my fault that they chose to lie, doubt, or manipulate. I couldn't control their actions, but I could control how I responded. One of the hardest moments came when my mom sent me a handwritten letter. In it, she apologized, sort of. She said she was sorry for not handling things better, but still insisted that they'd acted out of love. She begged me to come home for dinner so we could talk things out. I didn't respond. Her letter wasn't about taking accountability, it was about easing her guilt. For now, that door stayed closed. As the weeks turned into months, I began to feel lighter. Slowly, but surely, I started trusting myself again. I stopped blaming myself for what had happened and began setting boundaries with the people in my life. It wasn't easy, and I still had moments where the bitterness crept in, but each day I felt a little stronger, a little more confident in the path I was carving for myself. Months passed, and I finally started to feel like myself again. Cutting ties with Dave, Jenny, and even my parents had been hard, but it gave me the space to focus on what really mattered, rebuilding my life on my own terms. But the scars were still there. Every so often, I'd catch myself replaying the events in my head, the accusations, the betrayal, the hurtful words from people who were supposed to stand by me. I'd wonder if I should have handled things differently, but the truth was, I did the best I could. The turning point came when I decided to stop looking for closure from the people who hurt me. Dave, Jenny, and my parents had shown me who they were. I wasn't going to waste any more energy hoping for apologies that wouldn't fix anything. Instead, I poured myself into my passions. I started hiking again, a hobby I'd abandoned during the chaos. There was something therapeutic about being out in nature, away from the noise and stress of the world. I also reconnected with friends who had been there for me, organizing game nights and trips to remind myself that I wasn't as alone as I'd once felt. The biggest step, though, was forgiving myself. Not for the mistakes others made, but for the self-doubt I'd carried during the ordeal. I realized I wasn't at fault for trusting the wrong people, or for standing up for myself when no one else would. As for my parents, they continued reaching out, but I kept my distance. Their betrayal was too deep to brush aside, and I wasn't ready to reopen that wound. Maybe one day I'd consider letting them back into my life, but only on my terms. Dave? He became a ghost, a memory I didn't care to revisit. Whatever jealousy or bitterness drove him to destroy our friendship wasn't my burden to carry. Now, I'm finally at peace. Life isn't perfect, but it's mine, and I've learned to trust myself again. Sometimes losing people, even family, can be the first step toward finding yourself.